Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Geraghty.
And welcome, everyone, to the Monday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Jim Geraghty is back from the National Review cruise. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks to Dan Foster for filling in for Jim last week. We have all crazy martinis for Jim's return today. Crazy, crazy, and crazy. But Jim, I don't know exactly where the cruise went, but hopefully you're tanned and rested as we get ready for the home stretch here of 2018.
Greg, we hit all the usual Caribbean spots. Key West, which was a lot of fun. Had some good Cuban food there. Dominican Republic, I was traveling with my dad. We picked up a couple pitchers. I don't mean beer. I mean, the Nationals are going to need some. Turks and Caicos, which unfortunately have been clobbered by a hurricane once again. We always seem to hit it after the hurricane, and the little tchotchke shops are being rebuilt. And Half Moon Cay, which is basically owned by Holland America Line, and basically is like this little Potemkin village of shopping. So if you ever need Tanzanite or those T-shirts that change color in sunlight, this is the place to go. But, no, good time was had by all. I'm sure everyone on the boat would tell you, Greg, it's worth every penny just to hang out with me.
Yes, absolutely. Let's get to our first crazy martini now, Jim. And I can remember wanting to be White House Chief of Staff was fairly common. I mean, if the opening was there, people would probably want it. It doesn't seem to be that way right now. First of all, on Friday, Dan and I were talking about the drama back and forth about whether John Kelly was really on his way out of the White House. There were a lot of reports that his days were numbered, might be resigning as soon as Friday. Then Kelly said he was just taking the day off. There's nothing to report here. Well, by Saturday, we had this as Trump was heading off to the Army-Navy game.
John Kelly will be leaving, but I don't know if I can say retiring, but he's a great guy. John Kelly will be leaving at the end of the year. We'll be announcing who will be taking John's place. It might be on an interim basis. I'll be announcing that over the next day or two. But
well, it's 2 days now, and we still don't have a name, and there's a big reason for that. The initial reports on Friday that said that Kelly was on his way out said Mike Pence's chief of staff, a guy named Nick Ayers, was in line for the job, but Nick Ayers says, you know what? I'm actually going to go work on the 2020 campaign. Thanks, though. Then you had Mick Mulvaney. He's the budget director. Steve Mnuchin, Treasury Secretary. Thanks, but no thanks. Then a lot of speculation until late morning today about North Carolina conservative Congressman Mark Meadows. His answer, absolutely not. So, Jim, Chief of Staff should carry a lot of clout. It's a little different, obviously, in this administration, but what do you make of the fact that it's kind of hard to fill this position?
Yeah, I mean, for a long time, the perception was being White House Chief of Staff was like a good chunk of the power of the presidency with only a tiny fraction of the scrutiny and headaches and problems that come with being president of the United States. Generally, the chief of staff has a great deal of say about what ends up on the president's desk, what is prioritized. Some say on the travel schedule, some say on what the president should be doing on a day-to-day basis. Everything the president himself, all the details the president himself does not traditionally manage. So if you have a good relationship with your president, you can be a real power behind the throne. Obviously, you're trying to help the president succeed, and some White House chiefs of staff have been very helpful. Some have not been so helpful. Think about Andy Card and Rahm Emanuel, and those were the folks who made the Obama and Bush presidencies what they are. Trump has been through two of them. Trump is famously his own man, unmanageable, doesn't want to be managed, doesn't want to be restricted. And what he feels like focusing on can change very quickly. It's been called erratic. It's been called impulsive. He sees something on Fox News, Fox and Friends in the morning, and suddenly he sends a tweet about that, and all of a sudden, that's what the national dialogue kind of follows. And so Reince Priebus hasn't quite trashed President Trump. It is widely speculated that he was one of the sources for Bob Woodward in his recent book, Fear. We will see if that ever is panned out or Woodward ever reveals his sources. I don't think you have to be a mind reader to sense that John Kelly has had a great deal of frustration in the job, not always able to hide his emotions, either face palming or making other expressions of frustration in the background when Trump decides to go off script and follow his impulses in a completely unexpected direction. I think it's rather revealing. Trump thinks of himself as unmanageable, but the problem is that results people don't want to be in a position where one of their duties would be to manage you. And I know there's every once in a while there are rumors that Trump believes he doesn't need a chief of staff. look, somebody's got to decide what the president is doing on a day-to-day basis. And that's traditionally not the sort of thing the president himself worries about. The president kind of looks over the schedule, reviews it, says this is a good idea, this is a bad idea. The buck stops with the president. There's no illusions about that. But in the end, the chief of staff is kind of the handling logistics, handling all the smaller details and questions and stuff. So I think it's rather revealing that nobody really wants this job. I thought the interesting, I don't know about you, Greg, but the name that surprised me the most was Mark Meadows, just because, one, just got reelected to the House. Two, you're chairman of the House Freedom Caucus, probably one of the most influential groups among House Republicans on Capitol Hill. They can gum up the works on almost anything if they don't get their way. However, they're in the minority. I suppose that might be a reason to jump to the White House. But, you look at that district and, Mark Meadows winning by 59% in a lousy year, barring some terrible scandal, barring some dramatic redistricting or something like that, Mark Meadows is going to have that seat for a good long time. So you can have a long, distinguished career in the House if you want, or he could possibly run for some other statewide office. If you become White House Chief of Staff, besides the idea that you become scapegoat in waiting, it's just a matter of time before something goes wrong and Trump is likely to lash out at you. If it burned out Priebus within a year, if it burned out John Kelly a little more than a year, what are the odds that Mark Meadows would last 2 years and even beyond that? This is an exhausting job and even more exhausting under Trump. And I think it's rather revealing that Nick Ayers, the guy who everybody thought was going to be the next person stepping into this role, been, Vice President Pence's chief of staff, highly regarded, not just not taking the job, leaving the entire administration. I think This is a White House that's got some real problems, Greg, because everybody knows the last 2 years were chaotic and stressful under the best of circumstances, and the next 2 years with the Democratic House are probably going to be much worse.
Well, that's certainly the case. A lot tougher to get stuff through, certainly legislatively. He'll be able to get a lot of judges through, hopefully, now that Jeff Flake is about to be gone and there's an even larger Republican majority. But is there anyone you think is going to rise to the surface here? I mean, right now I'm thinking it's either going to be Jared or Ivanka, or Trump's just going to say, you know what, I can do this myself.
I would not be surprised if that was the case. What somebody's observing is that ideally you want somebody who has stature, somebody who can command respect. People thought Kelly was that kind of figure, and he was, but even he encountered a great deal of friction. I don't know if the stories of him grabbing Corey Lewandowski by the lapels and throwing him against the wall are true, but it sounds like this is a more tense and intensely divided White House than usual. You need somebody who can step in and kind of take command, and a White House staff that is, at least in the past, leaking wildly. It doesn't seem to be leaking quite as much these days. It's kind of tough. You need somebody who's probably closer towards the end of their career rather than somebody who sees it as a stepping stone. It's tough to persuade people to come out of, when you contemplate either your golden, happy retirement or jumping in and being the White House Chief of Staff for a couple of years. Kind of challenging. Tough to make that job look appetizing these days.
All right. Let's move to our second crazy martini now, Jim. And this one looks a lot like our crazy martini from Friday when Dan Foster and I were talking about the fallout of Kevin Hart being named the host of the Oscars. And then I think it was less than 24 hours later, he was no longer the host of the Oscars because folks had found some tweets back from, I think, 2009 maybe, where it said some things that weren't exactly the kindest towards gay people. Well, the mafia on this front is at it again, this time with our Heisman Trophy winner, USA Today. And I must say there's a twinge of good news here because the ratio on this USA Today tweet from Sunday is beautiful. But anyway, Heisman Trophy winner Kyler Murray had a Saturday to remember, by winning the Heisman Trophy. But the Oklahoma quarterback's memorable night also helped resurface social media's memory of several homophobic tweets more than 6 years old. When Murray was 15 years old, which is when you should have deleted the story, he tweeted at his friends via his since-verified Twitter account using an anti-gay slur to defame them. 4 offensive tweets remained active on his account late Saturday, but were eventually deleted by Sunday morning when Murray apologized for his insensitive language in a tweet. Murray is now 21 years old, and Jim, there's 2 things that pop into mind here. First of all, the Gestapo on these tweets is crazy now, going back to what was happening when kids were in their mid-teens. But also this is about, I think, explaining how people are supposed to think by the people who keep calling this out. Because I'm guessing that if Kyler Murray had said 3 years ago, with all due respect, I disagree with the Supreme Court's decision, I think marriage should be between a man and a woman, I bet he'd still be getting a whole lot of grief. And I don't think it's just because of the language he happened to use.
Absolutely correct. Here's the thing. Look, first of all, I was thinking about the context of the speech police and this idea in which you can get in, fairly serious trouble over things that are seen as teenagers just, mouthing off or just speaking their mind in their mid-teen years. Many of us remember being teenagers and not being so wise at the time. The two thoughts are, the first is that Twitter, all of us, particularly those of us who are in Generation X, who grew up and had our teenage years before the rise of social media, we all kind of, are looking at all this and going, because we think about all the dumb, stupid, offensive, obnoxious things we may have said in our teenage years, and there's no permanent record. If there was recording devices back in Metuchen High School in the late 80s and early 90s, I'd be in deep trouble because Lord knows how many things, never mind, just flat out offensive by the terms of then, never mind today's politically correct culture in which everything is expected to be nice and sensitive and all of that. So I was thinking about the musical My Fair Lady, Greg, because that's obviously where your mind goes in these sorts of topics.
Of course.
But the idea is that Eliza Doolittle, this kind of poor woman of the streets of London, can't interact with the high society of London because of how she speaks, because, the way you speak and the words you use say so much about her. And, of course, Henry Higgins is this professor of linguistics who, on a bet, decides he can turn her into a high society woman and blend in with the aristocracy of England of that time. That's what the whole musical is about. But the whole idea is that the words you use mark what class you are and what where you're supposed to be in society. And if you're not using the right vocabulary, you're now an untouchable, you're a deplorable, off with your head. And of course, this happens whether you've just won the Heisman Trophy and done something amazing, something you should be very proud about, or whether you're Kevin Hart and you've made people laugh in lots of movies all the time. Kevin Hart made those jokes years ago. People still kept going to his movies, right? Nobody's going to stop cheering for the Heisman Trophy winner because of stuff he tweeted way back when. But the other observation about this is also is that notice that these things always seem to surface as someone is having a great accomplishment. Somebody gets hired and all of a sudden they go through their tweets and they find stuff. It is as if we have this sort of social media secret police that are collecting paper on you, that are collecting things. And saying in high school, the teachers would say, if you act up like this again, it will go on your permanent record. And we used to chuckle, right? The idea that you get out of high school and the idea that there's some sort of file. Well, now there is. There's social media. And what you say on social media does go into your permanent record. And, this is, the dumb things said by a teenager 6-7 years ago. What kind of language are we expecting high school athletes to use? We shouldn't be surprised that there would be bad language in there. We shouldn't be surprised there'd be name calling and things like that. I know it's going to shock you, but there are a lot of terms for homosexuals used amongst high school athletes when they feel like someone hasn't played up to their potential, shall we say. This is something I think is ingrained in teenage boys. It's going to happen. And there's this idea that you really want people to, everyone in every walk of society, for all these people who claim about diversity, they want everyone to speak the same, use the same language, never use certain words, and of course think the same. And that's untenable with a free society. So I'm hoping this passes, and I'm hoping that in the end, first of all, I hope whoever hosts the Oscars bombs, and everyone says, boy, Kevin Hart would have been a better choice. And secondly, I hope this kid has an enormously successful and happy career, and it proves the sort of things you tweet when you're a teenager should not be held against you much later in life once you've matured. Greg, it was fascinating. There's one person who's managed to escape this. There's one person who people found offensive things she wrote and did not have any serious consequence for it, and that's Joy Reid of MSNBC. So I guess if you accumulate enough progressive points, you don't have to have any consequences for this. But for everybody else, off with their heads.
As of right now, this USA Today tweet highlighting this story has 8.3 thousand comments and 1,000 likes. Which means that most people are unloading on USA Today. And if you go in the comments, they absolutely are for dredging this up from when this kid was 15. So do you think we're reaching a blowback point now here where people are just so sick of this that we're going to see less of it, hopefully?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the reason you see people jumping on this, someone's just accomplished something, time to go through their social media feeds and find what's offensive, is that we've incentivized outrage. We've incentivized getting offended. It's a fair question of so why, how much time do you spend thinking about what your favorite college athletes thought and said in high school? Why would this matter to you this much? Do you think he's going to suddenly commit acts of violence or be some sort of hateful bigot because of things he said in high school? No, good heavens. My hope is that as these things die down, the reward for reporting them to these social media secret police ends up becoming not worth it, and people care about it less. Anger can be invigorating, right? You get this, this little burst of adrenaline. And I suspect that a lot of people get that emotional satisfaction out of finding someone pointing their finger and saying, "Shame upon you." It's the same. Ironically, it's the same impulses of like the Salem witch trials and every other great injustice in history, which is find someone to demonize, find someone to blame, and castigate them. It just feels really good. And my suspicion is that that'll be a tougher thing to get rid of than just having a few controversies pass quickly.
It's the old Eric Erickson line. You will be made to care. That's what USA Today was trying to do here, but hopefully the blowback is the sign of saner heads prevailing, slowly perhaps, over the near future. All right, let's move on to our final crazy martini now, Jim. And I know most people don't care that much about Time Magazine anymore. It's nowhere close to what it used to be, but they still do the thing that perhaps made them most famous, and that's the Time Person of the Year. Well, they've come out with their list of finalists here. 10 different people or groups that they believe are in contention for 2018 Person of the Year. Here's their list. Donald Trump, separated families, meaning at the border, Vladimir Putin, Robert Mueller, Ryan Coogler, who I'm guessing you know, but I had to Google him. He directed Black Panther, Christine Blasey Ford, Jamal Khashoggi, the March for Our Lives activists, Moon Jae-in, who's the president of South Korea, and my personal favorite, Meghan Markle, because clearly that's the biggest story of the year. She's the American actress who married Prince Harry earlier this year. Jim, I don't want to give anything away because we're going to do our highly prestigious Three Martini Lunch Awards at the end of the year. And I've already started kicking around some of the names for various awards, and one of them obviously is Person of the Year. I've got a handful of names in my head that I haven't decided from yet, and none of them are on this list. I mean, some of this is just bizarre. Some of these guys are genuine newsmakers, but others, you got to be kidding me.
There's always been this argument of, are you honoring like the best person of the year, or are you honoring the person who simply had the most influence on the year's events? Some very notorious figures in the past, Hitler, Stalin, Ayatollah Khomeini. Time being a different kind of publication back then, not afraid of outrage, is willing to say, look, our point is not hooray for these guys, but our point is when you look at the year 1979, the Ayatollah Khomeini had more influence over the events of that year than anybody else. And I think that's a very defensible standard, and going back for both Hitler and Stalin. And then somewhere along the line, they got scared. I think it's, I don't think it's outrageous to say that in 2001, Osama bin Laden had the biggest influence on the world's events because of the 9/11 attacks. It's very understandable that the Time Magazine editors kind of freaked out about the possibility of how people would respond just a few months after 9/11 of seeing bin Laden on the cover. They picked Rudy Giuliani, who obviously had a great deal of influence over that year. Now, the interesting thing is you look back year by year, and there's kind of this sense of, I would argue some of them were serious cop-outs. The whistleblowers of 2001 about Enron and the FBI kind of faded into history. 2006, selecting you. I mean, look, I don't know about you, Greg. It was a great honor for me. I'm also very proud of you. And for all of our listeners, a lot of people forget, 2006, you get down on yourself, you feel sad. Don't forget, 2006, you were the Person of the Year for Time Magazine. So feel good about that. It's interesting, Putin's on the list. He made it in 2007. I think it's very interesting that you could argue that he's more influenced than last year. The Silence Breakers, a selection of women who'd been sexually harassed, and the Me Too movement. I thought that was a perfectly fine selection, but it's just a weird group that, first of all, separated families. It was a big story. I think it's certainly not a global story, but I think that's the one they're going to end up picking, Greg. Just because it gives them a chance to get up on high dudgeon. They could say it symbolizes, the wave of xenophobic populism sweeping the world, blah, blah, blah. I actually wouldn't even mind Ryan Coogler. I thought Black Panther was a good movie. And you know what? Let's just face it. 2018 was a rebuilding year for newsmakers of the year. Let's give it to Ryan Coogler. Christine Blasey Ford, this one is just on there because if they didn't mention her, somebody would be really upset. Interestingly, Kavanaugh's not on the list. Right. But fine. Jamal Khashoggi, indisputably a big deal. But there, by the way, there's also, you notice this, the later in the year your news event is, the better chances you have of being named Person of the Year. I suppose you could say the changes in Saudi Arabia. Honestly, I think you probably could do MBS, the new prince who's kind of calling the shots over there, would be kind of a more useful figure. And again, if you're okay with saying we don't approve of this person, but this person had great influence over the world events. March for Our Lives activists, Greg, weren't they kind of forgotten by the time the election rolled around? Moon Jae-in, South Korea's leader, right?
Yep.
I mean, like, Korea's been kind of an interesting story. Give it to Meghan Markle. Give us a happy story time. Go for that. So, yeah.
Wow.
They're not doing Trump because, Trump would brag about it and then Time would have to apologize and then they'd rescind it and it would just be yet another social media controversy. By the way, I don't know if you know this, Greg, but you know why Time won't pick Trump?
Why?
Because he's tweeted some controversial things.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I understand you can't get the Heisman with that either.
Wow. He's going to have a lot of deleting to do if that's going to stop him from being Time Person of the Year again. But I think a lot of people forgot, Jim, that all of our listeners, plus you and me, and everyone in the world, really, was Time Person of the Year in 2006. So I think a lot of resumes are getting updated today with that one.
I was going to say, mention that. Lead with that, in fact. Although some people might say, well, what have you done lately? So,
Jim, welcome back. We'll do this again tomorrow. See you then.
See you tomorrow, Greg.
Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us. And tune in again on Tuesday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.